Good afternoon, Tom. We have a couple of questions from various sources. Some questions we haven't gotten to answer yet, a question from the Fireside Chat, some from emails, and some from our Patreon viewers. So the first question we have is from Armand. The signal line in remote viewing. In remote viewing, there's a term called signal line, which refers to whether one is on the right frequency with what they're remote viewing. There are also expressions like a target, having a strong signal or a weak signal. For example, if the target is a tree on a hill, or if the target is a test of an atomic bomb in the desert in the 1940s, the latter could then be classified as a stronger signal for many remote viewers to remote view. But if it is a database from which information is being retrieved, there shouldn't be any difference, or is there?
There's no difference in the database. The database doesn't hold some things more important than others. It's just the database. But there's a lot of difference in the remote viewer. In the remote viewer, it depends on what that remote viewer feels, the mood they're in, how they're feeling, the experiences they've had. For instance, you may be remote viewing, let's say your target is the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., where Congress meets. Well, one remote viewer, when given this target, gets a picture of Mickey Mouse. And you say, well, that's wrong. It's not Mickey Mouse. But then when you understand what he thinks about Congress, then it's exactly what he got was exactly right on. It depends a lot on the remote viewer. So he's, the target was that. So he sees a big Mickey Mouse going, and he thinks about the Congress as unable to function, dysfunctional, can't seem to get any good legislation out. All they can do is argue and fight with each other, and they spend their time on petty things rather than on the important things. And so he sees that whole institution as best being represented by the symbol of Mickey Mouse. Now, to say that they failed and he didn't get the target right, you have to understand that remote viewer, you see. So what you remote view is colored by what's inside of you, how you view things, what you think about things. And if you're a human being, you probably think that a big mushroom cloud is very significant to humanity. It could be the thing that wipes humanity off the face of the map, and most all the rest of the living things too. So it's a big thing. It carries a heavy emotional and cognitive signature. A tree on a hill, not so much. Now, if you are a naturalist and a tree on the hill is just an amazing, wonderful thing for you because you just love outside, you love trees, and you love hills, then it might be a toss-up. You might get that and not get the mushroom cloud. It just depends on your own biases, what your experience base is, what your beliefs are, what your fears are. If you're very fearful of nuclear annihilation, then that mushroom cloud would carry a big signature. You'd find it, terrifying. So you'd get that feeling from your target. The target's terrifying. And you might write that down. Terrifying. And still never actually see the picture of the mushroom cloud. You may just get the feeling of being terrified, or awful, or ugly, or terrible, dark, menacing. You may get all of those things, but never actually get a picture that looks like a mushroom cloud. Well, it doesn't mean that you failed. You're getting information from the database. The information you're getting is related to the information you're looking for. But it may be symbolic, like Mickey Mouse for the Capitol building. It may be emotional, like a huge I don't know what would be, like maybe a huge vicious animal or something might be something that you'd think was really scary, and you might get that instead of the mushroom cloud. So what you get and the data you get, you have to interpret. It's always like that with everything, even in everyday speech. Even with me, you're listening to me, you get my words, but you have to interpret those words into some sort of meaning inside your own consciousness. And that interpretation is your reality. That interpretation is what you will say that you heard from me. Now, if your interpretation is different than my intent, well, you would just swear that I said such and such, and I would just swear that I never said any such thing. You see? So, what we get is a data stream. What becomes our reality is our interpretation of that data stream. So, you have to look at the two things. And that is true whether you're remote viewing or whether you're talking to your neighbor. It always works that way. You have to interpret the information you get. He interpreted a Capitol building of the U.S. to be Mickey Mouse. That was his interpretation of it. So,
I'd never thought of it this way. Never heard someone say, but it makes sense because we are living in an individual reality. We're living in a subjective reality. And so it makes sense that you would have some filters, as psychics may have. They have a filter based on a fear or their experience or such things as that. It's very interesting. Now, with remote viewing, the important things are the elements of it, as you say, rather than the whole picture. Is that right? And how
mhm.
those elements form is interesting. That is also filtered
Yeah,
by our individual
by our
interpretation.
yeah, by our individual fear, individual knowledge, individual love, individual everything. Yeah, it makes us individual people. So everyone lives in their own personal reality because we may all get the same data in the data stream, we will interpret that data differently depending on our experience. So that's why in remote viewing there's some data seems to have a stronger imprint than others. It's because like a mushroom cloud will have a strong imprint on people. So well fundamental or obvious symbols like Eiffel Tower or the pyramids or things like that will have a everybody's seen those. Almost no matter where you live, if you have access to a computer, you've seen the pyramids or access to a textbook. It's just something that people notice. It's one of the big things on this planet that everybody's kind of aware of. So that's going to have a bigger signal than something that you've not seen before, particularly if you're not a great remote viewer. The better of a remote viewer you are, then the more precise your data is, the less fear you have, and the less you color it with your own stuff. When you're a beginner, you color a lot of it. So the thing is, it depends on why you're remote viewing. If you're remote viewing just to prove to yourself that such a thing exists, I just want a remote view to see if it's possible, then the fact that it's the Capitol building and you get Mickey Mouse, well, that's evidential. Or the fact that you describe all the feelings around the mushroom clouds, terrible, destructive, awful, but you don't actually get the picture, but that's still, you got the information. So, yes, you did get information from a remote viewing. Whether you get the picture or not, well, if you got the picture, it would even be better. But just the fact that you got all the right feelings, the right colors, the right impacts, that says that you were getting information. It could have been a children's birthday party, could have been the subject, and then awful and terrible wouldn't have been appropriate. You'd say that's a miss. But if what you had was a mushroom cloud and you say awful, terrible, destructive, then those are all hits, even if you never picture anything. You never actually saw the picture of the mushroom cloud. So,
Suppose the inventor of the atomic bomb was a remote viewer as well. Would that color the interpretation that he made? Would that necessarily mean the same things that someone else would get, this destruction, or would he approach it from a different way of how that was, the elements of how that was worked on, how it was
well,
developed?
it depends on the individual. So if you are one of the creators of the atomic bomb and you happen to be very bothered by it, you're disturbed by its awesome power and the destructiveness of it and the radiation it leaves behind and all the rest of the negatives and horrors, you may, and you were trying to what, remote view the future, that disquiet you had, that fear that you had of its destructiveness, that would probably come out into what you get. On the other hand, if you think that that atomic bomb is wonderful, it's terrific, it's going to end the war, it's going to save hundreds of thousands of people's lives that otherwise would be trying to shoot at each other, then you see it as a wonderful new piece of technology that's going to serve as electrical power and all kinds of other things. And then you have a very bright, positive, sunny disposition about nuclear explosions and nuclear energy, and you can see the advantages of that kind of power being perhaps harnessed to produce electricity or heat or some other valuable commodity. And then you'd have a whole different set of attitudes toward it. Those two people remote viewing the same thing would get very different answers because they have different perspectives on it. So the point is, you're going to a database and you're saying, describe to me what's in this picture. Okay. And the database sends things to you. Now, if you're a person that's very fearful of the atomic weapon, the thing that jumps out at you is, it's awful, it's terrible, it's horrible, it's going to destroy everything. If you're very positive and think this is great, what jumps out is you, oh, it's wonderful. It's a breath of fresh air and a technology that's going to save humanity. You see, you have a different, that's what jumps out at you. So you may get the same data, but if you happen to be very visually inclined, then you'd probably draw it. But you'd probably draw it as like a stem with a ball on top, sort of like a dandelion. You might even say it's a dandelion because you would be guessing at it once you got that image. It's a stick with a ball on top, and you may say, "Oh, it looks like a dandelion." That stick with a ball on top was a mushroom cloud.
Yeah.
So that's another thing. Your intellect jumps in and tries to guess. You get stick with a ball, and it's like, what that? Is that the letter I? Is that and your mind kind of goes through things before it decides it's a dandelion when really it's a mushroom cloud.
You should never draw a conclusion from the elements that you write down.
No,
Um,
no,
but
you should not.
but the atomic bomb, that is an element that has, as Armand suggests, a stronger signal. There's more emotion behind it than a
Right? A lot of
static
emotion.
building or
Right.
a tree. It's stationary.
But that
There's
that
no.
emotion is owned by the people doing it.
Mhm.
And those emotions are different, like I say.
Yeah,
Somebody sees it as horrible, somebody else sees it as the wave of the future.
yeah.
And therefore you're going to get different kinds of things. So when that guy got an image of Mickey Mouse when he was supposed to be looking at the Capitol building, that said a lot about his attitude toward the politics that go on in the Capitol building. It said more really about his attitude. But he got that because that's the thing that came back to him. Oh, what's there? Oh, that's the place where all the laws are made and where all the serious people are trying to run the country. He goes, yeah, right. Where all the people are screwing everything up. So ha ha ha, he gets a Mickey Mouse is what he turns that into. Yeah, remote
So
viewing has to have that personal, you can't get that personal filter out of it. That personal filter is going to be there. Now, if you're a good remote viewer rather than a poor remote viewer, you get rid of a lot of it. You learn not to put your interpretation onto things. You learn not to guess at answers. You learn some of the basics as you go along. And remote viewers that are very good and like 80, 90% right, they've done it thousands of times and they learn to set aside a lot of their own prejudices. But for most people who are just playing with it or just, interested in it, want to experience it, those prejudices come through very clearly
that's
in
an
the things.
interesting
In the,
distinction
yeah,
because to Armand's question, there shouldn't be any difference in that target. Or is the difference the experience of the remote
yeah,
viewer and the
right.
fact that we live in a subjective reality and we
Yeah,
interpret it?
yeah. So the very best remote viewers would all get something probably pretty similar, and they probably get things that were pretty close to the target. Otherwise, casual remote viewers will show more of themselves in it because they don't have the experience to get rid of those things. And you
So
only get rid of those with experience. You have to do it hundreds and hundreds of times, and eventually you know when you get things wrong, why you get things wrong, and then you try to fix that so you get better with it. So the answer to Armand is that the database isn't the problem here. It's the remote viewer. It's the human mind and the way that data can be transferred. But the consciousness gets the data and has to interpret the data. And that is an inexact process. In conversation, it works two ways. The speaker has to take what's in his consciousness and turn it into data, and then send that data to the receiver. Then the receiver receives the data and has to turn it back in to information with his consciousness. So both ends are inexact processes. The one who's sending it out, the speaker, they do the best they can to take what's in their mind, the thought they have, and put it into data, into words, into feelings, whatever. But that's not an exact science. There is no way to put your feelings and so on into precisely into words. You just pick the best words that do the best job of explaining what you're trying to explain. And depending on the size of your vocabulary, that can be very limited. And then the receiver has to take whatever data you send them and decode it based on their own prejudices and fears and things. So there's error introduced on both ends, the transmitter and the receiver. Now, with getting data out of the database, they don't have the transmit error. They're not getting, it's not being transmitted from a mind, but they are getting whatever errors are inherent in their language. Okay, let's say they speak English. Well, there are some things that are hard to explain in English. English doesn't have a lot of words to explain them. So if they're getting an English thing, then they're getting words that approximately explain what's going on. So again, there's error involved. And if they speak Chinese, well, Chinese may have a dozen words for explaining that thing because that thing is more part of Chinese culture. And then you may be able to explain it more precisely or less precisely. It just depends. One of the Samoan islands, they had like 27 different words for, what was it, for love or some other sorts of things that were personal. And we don't have that. We have like one word for it or maybe two, but they have a whole lot because it's very important in their culture. So they cut finely little nuances, get different words. So that's even in a database, it's got to be put into your language. Your language is data, and it's put into your language as best that the system can do that, depending on the vocabulary your language has. And then you get that and you interpret it. So there is some error also that can be put in even from a database because it has to use language.
Thank you, Tom. You've really covered that very well. I haven't had so much information on the different aspects of remote viewing as you've described, and I hope, Armand, that answers your question well. From your comments, it's obvious that you're one of the better remote viewers because you say there shouldn't be any difference in the targets, and as an experienced remote viewer, that would be the case. So interesting. Thank you very much, Tom.
I and MBT Events hope you like this video. If you do, then you should consider being a Patreon member because Patreon members get early access to our special content. You will also be able to get your questions answered by me in special Q&A sessions, and most importantly, your contribution as a patron member will enable us to produce the content that you're looking for. So thank you.